Welcome. Hi, everyone. My name is MD Murtagh, and I support programming at the Franklin Humanities Institute. Thank you. Welcome. Hi, everyone. My name is MD Murtagh, and I support programming at the Franklin Humanities Institute. Thank you. Welcome. Hi, everyone. My name is MD Murtagh, and I support programming at the Franklin Humanities Institute. Thank you. Welcome. Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. Thank you for joining us this morning, afternoon, or evening from wherever you are. Here's a quick overview of how we're going to run this event. You'll notice that your microphone is muted and your video is turned off. Each of our 4 speakers will speak for about 5 minutes, and then Lauren Ginsberg, Associate Professor of Classical Studies, will moderate a discussion. The discussion will last for about 20 to 30 minutes. In the last 15 minutes of the event, Dr. Ginsberg will moderate a Q&A, taking questions from the audience. We encourage you to work on drafting your questions during the event. You can send your questions through a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Note that the Q&A button is different from the chat button. Please keep in mind that we are learning how to host virtual events as we go, as you can see with some of the feedback we had just a moment ago, and that every event is different. We ask for your understanding if we have technical issues, awkward pauses, or any other problems. If our speakers' internet connections become unstable, we'll ask for your patience as we work to resolve this. If this does not work, or if we have other disruptions that we cannot resolve, we will end the meeting with the hopes of recording the event and sharing it with all who registered. If you have any logistical questions during the event, you're welcome to send them to me through the chat. For logistical questions, click the chat button at the bottom of your screen and send a message to host and panelists, and I will respond as I can. And with that being said, I will begin recording this event, and I will turn it over to Dr. Lauren Ginsberg to introduce our speakers.
Are we set? Great. Welcome, everyone. My name's Lauren Ginsberg, and I'm a professor of classical studies and theater studies here at Duke University, and I will also be your host and moderator tonight. We are so happy to have so many people joining us. I can see many more continue to come in. We welcome those from our Duke community, those from our Triangle communities, and also those from beyond our area due to the magic of Zoom. Our event tonight celebrates the recent visit of the Tony Award-winning musical Hadestown to the Durham Performing Arts Center, which has just closed after a week-long run. In honor of the fantastic performances last week, we've brought together both local professors from Duke University and special guests from the artistic team from Broadway to have a conversation with us about the themes of myth, gender, and music in Hadestown. In just a few moments, I will introduce my fellow panelists and also invite them to share some of their perspectives to get us started. After that, as we've heard, I'll lead the panelists in a discussion about many aspects of the show that collectively interest them. And then, as we noted, but for those coming in the final third of our program tonight, we'll turn the floor over to you so that you can ask any and all of our panelists your questions. To participate, you'll use the Q&A feature on the Zoom screen in front of you, and I'll be able to read your questions. We anticipate that our program should last about 90 minutes. And before I begin, I would like to give a special thanks to our co-sponsors, the Department of Classical Studies and the Department of Theater Studies, and the Franklin Humanities Institute. I'd also like to thank our support behind the scenes here, Jennifer Zhu and MD Murtagh. Without them, this webinar would be far less smooth, and I appreciate that. So I think with that, let's begin. I'd first like to introduce my colleague, Erika Weiberg, Professor of Classical Studies and Theater Studies. Erika works on gender, sexuality, and Greek tragedy here at Duke, and she's writing a book about women's experience of trauma in Greek tragedy. So welcome, Erika, and I'm sure that our audience here would love to hear some of your thoughts about Hadestown.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. Thank you to Lauren for that introduction and to Lauren and Ryan for the invitation to participate. I'm a scholar of Greek and Roman literature and mythology, and I'm especially interested in how the stories that different cultures tell are used to amplify or silence women's voices. Hadestown, the musical, oh, sorry, is there a technical issue maybe before I continue? See in the chat. Everyone can see me?
I think everyone can hear you, and we'll figure out why people can't see us.
Okay, all right, good. Excellent. So as I was saying, I'm interested in how the stories that different cultures tell are used to amplify or silence women's voices. And Hadestown, the musical, is an interesting example of this. So Hadestown is drawing on many different tellings of the Orpheus and Eurydice story from antiquity today. And no surprise, I'm going to be talking mainly about the ancient ones. The two most well-known versions of the myth that have survived from antiquity were told by the Roman poets Virgil and Ovid, who wrote during the rise to power and the reign of the Roman Emperor Augustus. These two poets were keenly interested in the problem that women's voices and their desires and their agency posed for Roman politics. Ovid's Metamorphoses, the work where he tells his Orpheus and Eurydice story, is full of gods abusing power and abusing women in the process. It's not too difficult to see in these representations of cruel and abusive gods a critique of the Emperor Augustus, who had implemented the ancient equivalent of anti-choice legislation, encouraging Roman women to have lots of babies. These laws were incredibly unpopular, as you might expect, and they were aimed at reining women in and circumscribing their role to the family and the home and suppressing their influence in politics. It's against this backdrop that Virgil and Ovid suppress Eurydice's voice in their versions of the Orpheus and Eurydice story. In Virgil's version, written just before Augustus became emperor, Eurydice does speak, but only after Orpheus has made that crucial decision to look back, and she laments the madness that possessed him in that moment to turn around. Ovid's version goes even further in silencing Eurydice. Eurydice says only the word goodbye in his version, while his Orpheus fills pages and pages and pages with cliched expressions of love and grief. Ovid's Orpheus is really an insufferable character, a parody of the semi-divine musician. So even though it's Eurydice's death that kicks off this whole story, we never get to hear in either of these versions about how she felt about Orpheus, how she experienced Hades, or whether she really wanted to return to the world above with Orpheus. Maybe Orpheus wouldn't have liked to hear what she would have said. In Ovid's version of the story, the lover so dedicated to his beloved that he risked his life to retrieve her from the underworld, ironically becomes the world's biggest hater of women and is torn apart limb by a group of women worshiping Dionysus as a result. Hadestown, the musical, is a tale told for a very different culture, one in which women's voices in politics are still suppressed, but also one that has begun to imagine roles beyond the confined scripts that these older stories created for them. The first half of Hadestown is really about Eurydice's tragic dilemma. Just like a heroine in a Greek tragedy, she faces an impossible choice between two bad options: stay with Orpheus and starve, or go to Hadestown without him and eat. Although this is a really constrained choice, we hear Eurydice agonize about it, make the difficult decision, and then regret it before she's reunited with Orpheus briefly in Hadestown. She even joins Orpheus in nearly fomenting a riot, posing a tricky problem for this musical's authoritarian leader, Hades. Although it's Orpheus's song that forces Hades' hand, it's Eurydice's voice singing alongside her fellow workers in Hadestown that actually threatens him. That's why the loss of her voice, her perspective, when Orpheus looks back is so very devastating. Even though it's Orpheus's song that has received so much attention, it's her voice that we're left dying to hear. So I think I'll stop there, but I'm very excited to talk more about these stories and gender, music, and myth in Hadestown.
Thank you so much, Erika. There's a lot that I think we're going to be able to come back to in the question and answer, and I wouldn't actually be surprised if some other people touch on similar themes. I'd like next to turn to my colleague, Ryan Donovan. Ryan teaches in theater studies here at Duke. He studies the body politics of casting Broadway musicals, which is the subject of his forthcoming book titled Broadway Bodies, A Critical History. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here and to welcome everybody from all over who joined us. Tonight, I'm going to talk about why Hadestown's success is so notable in the context of Broadway musical history, which is what I teach here at Duke. It's largely the case that Hadestown is so remarkable because it was written by, directed by, and largely designed by women, but it's also the fact that those facts are what make it so unlikely to have been produced on Broadway in the first place and to have won quite so many awards. Just a little spoiler alert, like Hermes sings at the beginning and end of Hadestown, it's a sad song, but we sing it anyway. As I was watching the show last week at DPAC and thinking about gender and myth in the show, I couldn't let go of this nagging feeling in my gut about how the myths depicted on stage about women suffering at the hands of men and men's actions was kind of a metaphor for the offstage situation of women in the theater industry, despite the myths that we'd like to believe about Broadway as an inclusive institution, which it is up to a point. And tonight, I'd like us to think about how Broadway musicals are so associated with women thanks to celebrated Broadway divas, but offstage, looking at the numbers belies the fact that the Broadway musical is not quite an equitable place, especially when it comes to gender parity. And tonight I'm going to use the Tony Awards to demonstrate where women's participation in the creation of Broadway musicals has been welcomed and where it has not. But before I get to the Tony Awards, I want to call our attention to another major award for Broadway shows, which is the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. The Pulitzer Prize for Drama has been awarded since 1918. So we're talking about 103 years of history, 104 years now of history here. And 0 musicals by a woman have won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama, and only 3 have been nominated in the past 104 years. The Tony Awards are not that much better. Before I get to the statistics there, just a little bit of background about how the Tony Awards work. There are currently 26 categories of Tony Awards divided between plays and musicals. The Tonys have been given out since 1947 by the American Theater Wing, and currently they're voted on by about 50 theater industry professionals who are the nominating committee, who come up with the list of nominations, which are then circulated to around 830 voters from all facets of the theater industry, from design to choreography, performance, but also to presenting and producing. So producers at touring houses like the Durham Performing Arts Center might be a Tony voter. The Tonys are intended to be a celebration of the best of Broadway, but I want to ask whose contributions have been celebrated and who was allowed to contribute in the first place. So in terms of the Tony Awards, if there weren't gender-specific categories for performers, I can't say that word, the numbers would be even worse than they are. In the categories not divided by gender, the numbers paint a picture that's far from inclusive. In the 7 decades that the Tony Award for Best Musical has been given, only 14 musicals with at least one woman writer has won. If it weren't for lyricist and librettist Betty Comden, that number would be just 10. Hadestown does represent the fact that change is coming if it's taken a really long time. It won the Tony Award for Best Musical, And this award goes to the producers. Hadestown's two lead producers, Mara Isaacs and Dale Franzen, are both women. And this is also a huge advance for Broadway. The award for Best Direction of a musical has also been given since 1960. Before that, it was just called Best Director and was both play and musical. Even so, it took until 1965 for the first woman to even be nominated for directing a musical. And it took until 1991 for two women to be nominated for Best Director of a musical, which has only happened 5 times since 1991. And it wasn't until 1998 that the first woman finally won for Best Director of a musical, and that was Julie Taymor for The Lion King. Rachel Chavkin's historic win for directing Hadestown in 2019 was only the 4th time a woman has won this award. That's 4 women in 72 years of awards. For choreography, it's not much better, I'm afraid. Even though dance is often considered women's work in the United States, only 8 women have won the award for Best Choreographer, 3 of them multiple times since 1947. The same number of women have won for Best Score, and Anais Mitchell's win for Hadestown made her just the 2nd woman to win for writing the music and lyrics without collaborators, following Cyndi Lauper's 2013 win for Kinky Boots. I also want to note that only one all-female writing team has won this award, and that was in 2015 when Lisa Crone and Janine Tesori won for Fun Home. So there's been, the last few years, the last 10 years or so, we have started to see a shift, and yet the numbers are, telling that the shift hasn't been that profound yet. More numbers, 6 women have won the award for Best Book of a Musical. 2 women have won for Best Orchestrations. Not surprisingly, the category where women have won the most awards is Best Costume Design, where 18 women have collectively won 31 awards. 8 women have won for Scenic Design, including Rachel Houck's brilliant design for Hadestown, and 1 for Sound Design, which happens to be Jessica Paz for Hadestown as well. 5 women have collectively won 11 awards for Best Lighting Design. And it's not just the Tony Awards that are the problem, of course. It's the entire industry. It's America, where we literally devalue women's labor to the tune of 16 cents less per dollar earned by men in the most recent figures available. And it's not just gender. The vast majority of female Tony Award winners I've noted so far are white women. When director Rachel Chavkin accepted her Tony Award in 2019 for Best Director of a Musical, she implored the powers that be to rectify this lack. She said, quote, "This is not a pipeline issue. It is a failure of imagination by a field whose job is to imagine the way the world could be." The seasons since Hadestown have each only had 2 musicals apiece directed by women. While we raise our cups to Hadestown's stunning success and the fact that 4 of its 8 Tony wins were for women's contributions, the nagging feeling in my gut lingers that, like Persephone's increasingly irregular and unpredictable visits above ground, women's contributions to Broadway musicals remain limited engagements too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ryan. Already we can see the connections between silencing women's voices and also the women's voices that we're allowed to hear when we're allowed to hear them at all. Now I'd like to welcome one of our first special guests from outside the Triangle area, Sean Mays. Sean is currently working on 2 Broadway musicals, so we are very grateful that he is here on his night off. He's the Associate Music Director of Hadestown, and he's also the Assistant Conductor of MJ the Musical. He's also just published a book with Sarah Whitfield titled An Inconvenient Black History of British Musical Theatre. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you for the invite from you and Ryan and all the folks here. And hey to y'all on your screens or listening in wherever you are. So good to see so many numbers. I'm thrilled to be invited to speak a little bit about my work with Hadestown. And in thinking about this for this evening, I wanted to just share some thoughts out in terms of what my experience has been as a musician, as a creative with the show, and why I have a particular affinity towards it musically as well. So I'm just going to share some of those thoughts, and I hope that they'll be provoking as well for what I'm sure will be an interesting time afterwards as we dive into our Q&A. As Lauren mentioned, I am one of the associate MDs on the show and associate conductor of the show. And of course, if you've seen the show, you know that the show largely resides in this world of really utilizing music to the fullest extent as far as a musical is concerned. Of course, there is very, very little spoken text in the show without music behind it as well. And as a musician, of course, specifically in the world of musical theater, that's very exciting. And the history, of course, of the show, as many of us will know, in terms of its start as an album and that work from Anais Mitchell in terms of becoming, over the course of roughly a decade, the stage musical is very cool. And of course, I think there's some interesting ties into why we have such an affinity towards this music, right? The show really drives, when I conduct the show, I conduct from the piano and I also play accordion. And in keeping with the sort of tradition of having to pick up an accordion and do this, it's very representative of where the music is from, right? It's all very Americana, right? And there's lots of unpacking that we could do in that in terms of what that sound is, the origins of that sound. There's the score is described as not being limited to folk, to country, to blues, to rock, to swing, gospel certainly, and then even really utilizing even more contemporary elements in that end musically as well. And I think that is why, even as far as our love of this show, especially as musical theater lovers, we are so drawn to it, and we have such a love of it, because it is music that is of the tradition that, again, even as we listen to popular music, is all derived of a very specific line and a very traceable line. As Lauren mentioned, I do a lot of scholarly work on the recovery of Black artistry, particularly in musical theater, with my collaborator, Sarah Whitfield, as well. And we've just recently done a lot of that work and retracing that in Britain. But I think it's a very specific thing to talk about that in the context of Hadestown too, because this musical and this music utilizes a lot of Americana. And when we talk about Americana, of course, we have to consider the contribution and, quite frankly, the foundational aspect that is Black music and Black Americana, as far as that music is concerned as well. As a Black creative on the show, certainly that's that resonates with me a lot, and being able to be able to play that music night after night and have it be so appreciated at such a deep level. And I think that it's very interesting in considering, seeing even some of the comments as well, as far as the usage of musicians in the show, particularly. I know that's something that, as a design and again, when we're talking about these structural utilizations of music, these dramaturgical utilizations of music, these character utilizations of music in the show, which are very, very cool for me, and a couple of them just to even share. Particularly when we think of structurally, dramaturgically as well, character-wise, the notion of, and each character intersects with music in such a specific way, which is so fascinating. The character of Hermes, right, and particularly in the context of the Broadway production, when Andre is doing it, is really utilized as the griot, right? For those who know the term, as the West African keeper of stories and knowledge, and that sort of utilization of using very specific textual, almost like very textual based music in order to convey and to share story is a very, very cool element of that, character wise as well. There's a utilization of Orpheus, of course, Orpheus always having a guitar in hand, and what that means that we are talking about a musical that is specifically talking about somebody who is creating music, who is using music as a device to pull us through this myth, right, which is very fascinating. The utilization of the band being on stage and in many ways always a part of the action, but explicitly so when we enter into the world of Persephone and Persephone's mind, right? And Persephone's music is, again, very specifically driven in a very often funky, very slinky way, right? When we're moving through that music in the show, which is super, super cool. Specific calls and references to the band as well. Hades is very similar, right? The music embodies a great deal of gravitas. The biggest number in the show at the end is, of course, where he sings and is debating about the notion of how do you make a choice, right? How do you let him go or not? How do you let Orpheus go or not? And that sort of utilization of music and that control and gravitas as well. So I think it's and of course the fates utilization. We have a lot of very active actor musicianship taking place in the show too, and that is real. That's happening in live time. The fates do play those instruments as well. And are very specifically linked to that as well. So again, just a couple of little tidbits to drop in terms of the musical world of it, but it is a very unique experience because we do not exist exclusively as an aside, right? Music is truly fully integral to the show, and that's why, as a conductor and as an artist on it, as a creative on it, it's a remarkable time to be able to bring that story to life night after night.
Thank you so much. I already myself have so many questions, but I'm of course going to sit on them for a little bit, but that was fascinating, especially the different registers and the dramaturgical ways in which the music is structuring the musical. So thank you. But now I think certainly not least, although unfortunately last, I'd like to call and welcome Ken Cerniglia. Ken is a veteran Broadway dramaturg whose credits include not only Hadestown, but also Aladdin, Newsies, and then another musical that's near and dear to my heart, Peter and the Starcatcher. He's also the past president of the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. Ken has been with Hadestown since it premiered on Broadway, and I'm sure has a lot to share with us today. So thank you very much, Ken.
Thank you for that. And thanks for my head's exploding with all of these ideas that have come up so far. And I've been with Hadestown like 4 years, even longer before it came to Broadway.
Sorry about that.
I'm also, no worries. I'm also very aware of like the irony of like me, a man, representing this show written entirely by a woman, directed and developed by a woman, produced by women, designed by women, right? So I just want to acknowledge that, and I will try to be the best possible ally and representative of something that I believe is successful because it's generated and led by women. I came onto the project after, so Aeneas, I do recommend this if you haven't read it yet. Aeneas published a book last year called Working on a Song, which investigates the lyrics of Hadestown, which is very lyrically driven, as well as the music that Sean's talking about. But she, she started that and developed it. She grew up in Vermont. She actually has her degree in political science, which shouldn't surprise you if you look at what's going on in Hadestown, but didn't study music formally, but as this amazing, folk rock singer, songwriter, had developed it as sort of a community theater song cycle. It toured around for a while. She ultimately recorded it on Annie DeFranco's label. Annie played Persephone, Aeneas played Eurydice, and got a bunch of folks from that musical world to be on the album, and that toured around a bit. And while that was touring, a producer who's running the Broad Theater in LA, who comes from the opera world, Dale Franzen, saw it. And she, coming from the opera world, had experience with other opera versions of these myths, particularly Eurydice. And so, I think I love the way that you're telling the story. It's a new way of telling the story. I think this could be something. And she brought Aeneas to New York, and eventually they were looking for a director to sort of take it into the legitimate theater world. They went to see Rachel Chavkin's first production of The Great Comet, and that was at Ars Nova in a very small space. Aeneas fell in love with it, met Rachel, and they started their journey together. and taking this song cycle narrative piece, very interesting investigation of these myths, from Virgil and Ovid, and had all these adaptations ever since. And Aeneas was interested in intertwining some stories of Orpheus and Eurydice and Hades and Persephone, and illuminating that in a new way. And so started working with Rachel, took it to New York Theater Workshop, where I had worked on Peter and the Starcatcher, which it actually isn't a musical in terms of structure. It's a play with music, play with some songs. But we had done that at New York Theater Workshop, and that's how I sort of got introduced to them. So Aeneas is a first-time dramatist, really. She's an amazing singer-songwriter, knows about the structure of a song, and writes really good songs too. But in terms of like making a play out of that, even though they had sort of done it as a theater event, it wasn't quite a play yet. And Rachel Chavkin, our director, is also quite a good dramaturg, but it got one person writing a whole musical by herself for the first time. And then Rachel is going to direct this bigger event. And so they wanted to bring someone else into the development of the story. And so that's how I came on board. And so we were at New York Theater Workshop, had a production there in 2016, got this great opportunity to go out of the country, out of the country for Hadestown. So we went to Canada, in Edmonton, and had a production there. Took something that was originally Rachel Hauk designed it in the round completely at New York Theater Workshop, and sort of like this tent revival kind of approach to production. There were these wooden risers and found chairs everyone sat in. It was amazing. And also, so for those of you who've seen Hadestown, in that version of the show, there were only 8 performers, aside from the instrumentalists and the band. Only 8 singers. There are our sort of 5 principals, the 2 couples and Hermes, the 3 fates, who also sang chorus. So if you've seen the show now, imagine like all of the chorus parts of the show were sung by the principals as well. So in terms of like following the trajectory, not everyone knew everything that was in Aeneas's head in terms of what the workers, who they were and what they represented. So that's the journey we started on in developing the show. We had workers in a first pass in Canada. We were able to then take it out of town country again, and got this great opportunity to do it at the National Theatre in London, and got to explore even more. And that's really where Rachel Hauk, our set designer, who had taken sort of one pass at a proscenium production in Canada, kind of scrapped that and then blended it in with what we originally have. And that's the set design you see now, which is a little bit more New Orleans inspired, but brings the band back on stage and kind of completes this, essentially taking back to myth, right? A sort of Greek orchestra idea of enveloping the whole space, of like everyone is seeing this together, and having the audience also represented by the band coming around and witnessing this performance. The other part of development too, we didn't start there, but like, what are the gender roles in this telling of the story, right? There's very little, as we've talked about, there's very little, prominent representation, even though a lot of women working in the industry. In terms of leadership positions, there's very little representation. So that's something going on, as Ryan has talked about, behind the scenes and in history. We're very well aware that, at least in terms of gender parity, we were pretty well represented in delivering the show. But we're also working on this show in this kind of, in a Me Too era, right? So like, we're developing the show in different iterations, and like everything that we're thinking about in terms of inequality, in terms of exploitation, we're dealing with that in the content of the show. And so trying to calibrate then, what do we learn about gender roles, power dynamics, class dynamics in this play? And the world that we live in was certainly having an interrelationship with the world we were trying to create on stage, and even the theme of the show. This idea of like that Orpheus can see the way the world could be, but what do we do about the way the world is now, right? And this is the tension that we have in the show. And Aeneas is very clear about what she sees in the world, and the questions she's asking about the world. And we spent a lot of time particularly on the arcs of Orpheus and Eurydice, and trying to get them calibrated in a way where we could ask important questions about sort of the next generation. We sort of see this mature relationship in Hades and Persephone, and even Persephone's role kind of altered over time, where, I don't know, Amber Gray, who originated Persephone, has an article in New York Times weekend before last, where she's sort of interviewed about it and the shift that we made in Persephone. We kind of, we're in London and we're asking some new questions about Persephone. And, is Persephone completely a victim in the way the world has gotten off kilter, or is there some complicity there, right? And asking a tough question when you've got someone as powerful as Hades, the man who's making decisions about the world, but like, where do the rest of us fall when we support it or don't speak up when we notice something is wrong? And that's something that Amber was trying to pursue in Persephone. And then we're looking back at Orpheus and Eurydice, like, where do they have agency? Does that have anything to do with gender? What are the questions we're asking now? And working particularly with Eva, when she came into the mix, and what would Eurydice be? We shifted the opening numbers, right? We had started with sort of this prologue, kind of Any Way the Wind Blows is the scene setter, and then that kind of became her thesis song once we shifted things around, because we're like, well, Eurydice has to come out and tell us what she wants and how she sees the world, and how does that support how Orpheus is in the world, and how does that support where she is in the world. And like, we're still, we spent a long time trying to discover that and trying to sit in a place of like, where's audience sensibility now, right? Like, we're not the audience that Virgil and Ovid were writing for. Where are we now in our world? And how can we use this platform, the sort of the form of the American musical told in this way, which is operatic in many ways. We don't ever stop the music. Sean can say like maybe 2 measures, right? Like, hardly ever stop the music in this. So this music is driving it. What does that do to our emotions? What does that do to our cognition? As we're, and what does it do? Like, who do we identify with when we see things? Who are these sort of other constant characters of Hermes, the storyteller, the messenger of the gods, and the fates, who are just representing what is and will be, right? Like, do they have a role? If you know about your fate, what is this voice in the back of your head? And then told in this like really interesting musical form, which Sean can expound upon, but like this very tight harmony, Andrew Sisters inspired, really fun and engaging, but effing scary kind of way. What does that mean? How do those 3 women on stage representing the fates, these sort of 3 old women who are like played by very young, strong women, which is very funny too. And so I'm asking, like, I've never spoken on a panel like this, or we talk about like myth and gender, and yet like my whole experience on it was very much informed by paying a lot of attention to gender, and then being in a work development arena that was led by women. And I will tell you like a million times, and I worked on a lot of shows, that Hadestown's particular success, other than the talent of the individuals who were assembled to make it together, but the fact that it got to the place that it got to, I will say 100% is attributable that all the decision makers were women. That made a huge difference. So I'll stop there because I want to answer questions and engage in discussion, but I could talk forever. Thank you.
Great. I mean, we could listen to you talk forever, so thank you so much. I think that we're going to have a really rich discussion, and yeah, you've given us a lot to think about. And what I want to share with everyone is that one of the great things about getting to be the moderator for an event like this is I now actually get to ask all these people questions, and questions that I think came up in our early discussions that were of interest to them. So I'm going to throw out some questions to all of the panelists, and we can get them all on screen here. And just to let everyone know, this is where the interactions would become slightly easier if we were in a room as opposed to on Zoom. But I'm hoping that I can actually just get all of my fellow panelists to have a cool conversation. And I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A that you guys have been submitting. Please continue to submit those questions. But I'm delighted to see that a number of people are interested in what was going to be my first question to people, which is let's talk about Persephone, which a bunch of you have brought up in different ways. She's my favorite character by far. I think it's so interesting that on the one hand, she has so much power as an agent of change, but at the same time, even though she's electric and captivating on stage, she's at least viewed by other people, including Hades, as living in a gilded cage. I think she might think she lives somewhere in between. So I was wondering what you all make of Persephone's portrayal, her songs, her character arc in the show. And I'm just going to throw it open to whoever wants to start answering.
I'll jump in and say she's also my favorite character. And I think it's probably because she's a kind of character that's very familiar to musical theater lovers. I mean, she's kind of what the musical theater scholar Stacey Wolf has identified as this trope of like the female character who's celebrated in performance but punished in the show's narrative. So like we thrill to Persephone's glorious mess, even though like, you know, we understand the constraints placed on her. So in that way, she's kind of like Charity from Sweet Charity, or Christine in Phantom of the Opera. You know, think of examples from different eras that, you know, we kind of, as musical theater audiences, are familiar with that kind of figure, but you know, it doesn't make the dynamics less interesting or less troubling, I guess, but maybe that's why we're drawn to them, because they're complicated and messy, and you know, she's the character who breaks the fourth wall to talk to the audience at times too. So that gives us this kind of reciprocal relationship with her that we don't enjoy with all of the other characters.
I'll jump in and talk a little bit about this too from the perspective of myth. In the ancient versions of this story, I mean, one of the most important parts of Persephone's story is that she goes to the underworld unwillingly. And I think that you see that a little bit in this musical as well, that she doesn't consent to this situation necessarily. And I think it also comes out in the way that she's positioned as this kind of third person onlooker to these dynamics that are happening between Hades and Eurydice, where you question too, like how much does Eurydice consent to what's going on with Hades? And so I think that the musical is bringing in these themes of consent and voice and agency for both of these intertwined characters in interesting ways. And like Ken was saying earlier, really getting to this question of complicity, like who is complicit here? And what is the role of Persephone, for example, to speak up on behalf of Eurydice in that moment? What's the role of the audience who's looking on in this kind of voyeuristic way?
And I have a comment.
Yeah,
oh, go ahead. Finish, Erika.
No, I was just going to say, and you know, the fact that it happens behind closed doors, that interaction between Hades and Eurydice too, I think is important. So
I'm going to sort of throw from something that, you know, Ryan brings up about this trope, right, of this character that kind of Persephone could be categorized in. I want to throw it to something Sean said before about something unique that happens, right? So Hermes is our storyteller, right? So Hermes has special access to the audience as the narrator. Then halfway through the show, we take an intermission, we come back, and all of a sudden, Persephone can see us too. And she can sing to us. She breaks the fourth wall. She acknowledges the band members that are playing for our show. And I wonder like what that does. And I'd love to hear from the audience too. Like, you know, a lot of people are like, oh, I love Persephone. Like, the people we have, like Amber Graves started it, Kimberly Marable, who you saw, right? Like, they're just amazing performers. We have X, but I'm wondering structurally with that, like breaking the fourth wall, when we have this special access to her, does that affect our perception of the character, or how does it? Do we take her side more than if we hadn't seen her sing Our Lady of the Underground, where she got a special like kind of window into access to us?
I can say for me, it's, oops, sorry.
Go ahead.
For me, it's interesting because there are characters in ancient Roman drama that do this all the time. And in certain genres of ancient Roman drama, these are disenfranchised people. These are people that are given a special amount of power when they're on stage that the social world that they're trapped in doesn't. And so often enslaved characters. But then there's another type of Roman drama, which is much sadder, Roman tragedy, in which it's the most powerful characters who can have the most destruction, actually, who are the ones that are allowed to bond with the audience. And so I don't know for me that it's necessarily that it makes her more sympathetic, but I think it does make her connect in a way where she seems for at least that moment to be smarter, to be more intelligent, to be more interested in us, and to let us have some special knowledge about this world that we're already enwrapped in by the end of the intermission. So I do think that that's a moment where you're brought into her world where she becomes special to you, or at least to me.
And if we don't take her side, it's almost too depressing to bear, I think. This moment that you're talking about at the start of Act Two is also so interesting structurally because it comes right after, the end of Act One, where Eurydice has gone to the underworld and Orpheus has decided to rescue her from there. And so you're kind of, as an audience member, expecting to pick back up with that at the start of Act Two. And so it's a nice surprise dramaturgically when you're sitting there and you're like, oh, it's Persephone, and wait, she's talking to us. And she's telling us, about the band and acknowledging that that we're at a performance and that this is live theater. And, it's kind of accomplishing so many interesting things at once. It's actually one of my favorite moments of the show, even though sometimes when I've seen it and I'm sitting there, I'm like, does this make sense to me? And then I'm just like, who cares? It's really fun.
That moment too, at the end of the first act, when she breaks the fourth wall and says, I need a drink, in a way, it kind of brings us into this critique of capitalism as well, and like the, for-profit theater, and the fact that we're in a theater and maybe about to go buy a drink. And so I think that her role is this kind of, she makes us aware of our complicity in this larger situation and in interesting ways.
I think especially because that's the response that she has to her husband taking a young girl behind closed doors, as it's being pointed out what happens behind closed doors. And her facial expression or her stance leads you to believe that she's jealous in that moment. And then she turns around and says this very bawdy, playful thing to us with almost a wink. I also find that a really powerful moment.
Yeah, and sort of this is just mentioned by someone in the chat too, but the line afterwards, or at the top of Our Lady, right? Step into my office, right? And the having to connect that to being like, oh, okay, like she's putting her hands on the steering wheel, right? She's driving this thing now, right? And claiming that back from the energy of what we're set in at the very end of Act One, which is this very heavy, it's like we go down there, and then the entirety of the end of the act is this massive sequence that Hades just drives, right? That is just like, you're like, okay, he's in full command here. And then that recalibrate. I've always found that line very interesting. And to a moment of being like, it is to my office, right? Because it could have been step into my office, right? And it is that's the emphasis of the line there, right? And you're like, okay, the story is hers at the top of it, which is very interesting.
And Sean, you started to say some things about Persephone musically, sort of the structure of her music and the sound of Persephone in your bit in the beginning. Would you be willing to say some more things about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's interesting to consider. Yeah, I think that like all of it's interesting to see even just like the moments where I spoke a bit to the how Hades and the way that Hades's music also has this sort of element of gravitas to it, right? And command and control to it as well. And I think it's interesting to see like also like her journey through it musically, right? Like the entry point of the party, right? And you know, in the top of the first act, and then once we hit the second act, and using still very much this party song, but like, and then it has these, we start to see these elements of, yeah, like the crack in the wall. We start to see the, you know, how the mood starts to shift ever so slightly. And then the closer and closer we get to the end of the act as well, you know, how long we start to see sort of, they're both very, very driven, I think, in terms of how what they bring musically is so strong. And then you start to see that come closer and closer together. So at the point where we hit how long, it's just this immense, you know, like we're just watching this immense amount of power as a couple, right? Even just musically, right? In terms of how they are sharing phrasing and how they are going back and forth on that, right? And how that bringing that closer together is part of that reconciliation towards the end. But I do think it's fascinating on that musical journey that then we arrive at the end, and she's still really in control. I think she's still in control by the end of that too, right? Even as hate, you know, there's the moment of, you know, when he finally sings the song, right? This is what she's been saying the entire time, is like, you know, what are you so afraid of? What's going on? And then he breaks, right? So it's interesting. It's just interesting on that scope of the musical journey of it as well, and particularly comparatively so, because they're both very, there's a lot of power in it. They're both like slinky and cool in their own capacities. But I do think that she kind of, it's not about winning, but there's she's the last thing I think that we're left with on that end musically as well, which is very interesting.
So if I
Could talk about them for, no, I mean, I could talk about them forever, and the sort of like calibration of like, when does she dive in? What does she say? Like just one sort of line here, one line there. I mean, my favorite part of the show, and just like the complexity of their relationship, is, you know, when she goes in and they're gonna, you know, he does say, you know, go on this journey. You know, she's like, Hades, you let them go. It's like, I let them try. And then how about you and I? We'll try again, you know, next, you know, spring, you know, and fall. And that we get the sense that after they, that, you know, we don't know what's going to happen. We hope that Orpheus can get Eurydice out of Hadestown. But in the meantime, this whole adventure has helped heal their relationship, which has actually saved the world. Right? And then we're going to go see what's going to happen to Orpheus and Eurydice. But this is all like, Hades and Persephone run the world. Like they're the balance of those two powers that has to stay in balance, or else the world is doomed. And that's what these are the stakes there. And then to have that play through these two humans in a very mature, complicated relationship, it's like, I'm endlessly fascinated by it.
Ken, that moment is so fascinating to me in terms of the choices that you all made, and that their reconciliation comes through dance. That it's when they dance together that we understand that their connection has been restored. And I'm curious. I mean, I guess dramaturgically, you know, Orpheus has just sung, you know, the complete epic he's been working on. So what was behind the choice there to actually have them turn to, you know, this other mode of expression in terms of musical theater forms rather than singing or speech?
Well, if you listen to the concept album, you'll actually hear a different tune, which is based on which is an arrangement of a folk tune. That's not Aeneas's. It's a different thing. It was very joyous. We had it at New York Theater Workshops on the concept album, and we got to a place in London where we were really wondering about what that tune would be. And at that point in the storytelling, we'd made the decision that what Orpheus sings, those la-las, were not something that he wrote, but something that he found, a melody that he found, the old song. And that was not where we started, right? Like this is the change in the dramaturgy. So it only made sense if his mission is now to bring this song back. It's that, the gods have forgotten the song of their love. This is the song that he found, and he's got to get it back to them. Once he does, then the thing that they do, then it's just the melody. The melody is their love song. And then Aeneas and Todd and Michael created that arrangement of that. It's an arrangement of the la-las. That's what they dance to. And so this old thing that was in the show, and like actually Rachel fought hard to keep it because she loved it so much, but we made the dramaturgical argument that no, they have to dance to their love song. And so that's what they do, and there are no words, it's just a melody. So that's why they just dance.
Great.
I love the moment when they dance, when they kind of shimmy and look at each other in this sort of very playful addition. It's a beautiful, so many different types of dance are brought up in that moment. I wanted to see if I could shift a little to something that Erika had mentioned with Persephone's sort of gesture to the fact that the audience of Hadestown was about to be able to go out and consume things and sort of confront the fact that they're voyeuristically sitting in the audience and seeing people in pain. And that was to think about the role of capitalism in this musical. So the fact that a key enemy is hunger and poverty, specifically maybe capitalism's abuse of hunger and poverty to its own advantage. And I think there are many ways that theater can tell that story, and that theater has told that story. And so maybe this is just the classicist in me, but I'm interested in why we use Greek myth to tell that story, or maybe another way how the characters of myth help us make that story powerful to an audience today, because it's not necessarily the most obvious thing that you could have used.
Just very briefly, because I don't want to monopolize the time, but that is something that Aeneas is in particular interested about, and that some of the musical inspirations for the show come from like very grounded American folk music, and like Woody Guthrie, and like even like some Dust Bowl images and people migrating because times are hard, right? The winds are changing, the environment's not supporting livelihoods, you've got to move on. And that these forces, right? Like we were living in worlds with like environmental crises very much on the mind, right? Political crises very much on these forces that are larger than life. How have we been dealing with them as human beings since the beginning of time? They've been in our stories, right? And these myths and mythology, like these are characters represented by humans on our stage, but these gods are their ideas about the human condition. So they represent these ideas. And so it seemed like kind of a great way to dive into it. And then, to have that refrain, it's an old song and we're going to sing it again because the human condition actually doesn't change until we destroy ourselves, right? Then it doesn't matter. But like, as long as we're here, as long as we're struggling, the human condition is the same. So yes, these myths still resonate. We tell them in different ways because we're interested in different aspects, but like what they represent, these characters are still us, aspects of ourselves and what we're, and the challenges. So I feel like that's why it's kind of rich, and why, the way that we set Hadestown, that there are references to our world, but also references to times past. Like people are like, when's Hadestown set? I'm like, you tell me, right? Like now, then, in the future, like, I don't know. The myth kind of works. So we just leave it there.
Yeah, I love that, Ken. And I think just like, saying a yes and to that, right? Even when we consider like the notion of like the blues and the notion of, like gospel and these traditions that have also come out of very specifically, like music that has been created as a method of not just exploring human condition, but also specifically exploring the depths of that at its saddest in some moments, right? And that those, if you think of something, when I remember when I was doing the work to onboard for the show, one of the moments I think that is so interesting is like the end when we recalibrate for Road the second time. And I remember somebody describing it to me as like, it's interesting because it the way, even just in the and this is such a cool thing, which I could go on about this forever in terms of the orchestration of the show and some very, very specific orchestral techniques that are within the show that give it the funkiness that make it so cool that we all love. But that's a whole.
We would be happy to let you do that if you wanted.
There's amazing things in it, and like one of the interesting things is even just like how the like for instance the piano part and how the piano is written for that final number too, right? And how I remember someone describing it to me as it's sort of this reference to gospel without like ever like fully playing it in and reading it out to you. This is what this is, right? And so there's a moment for me when I play that on stage, I'm like, I actually think that in many ways that's the most reverent moment of the show, because it is like you have, the griot, Hermes, coming forward again. And like, if you've sat, I mean, anytime you've watched that show, you sit there at the start of row 2 at the very end, and it demands your attention, right? So you have this minister, this congregational leader, bringing us back after all of this journey, and saying, okay, like singing a cappella, nothing but a voice, focus. And now here's the journey of being like, okay, this is why we've used all these devices. And we get taken to church, right? We get taken to church, and it's the lesson of being like, yeah, life is hard, times are hard. And, it's like even going back to the question of like, I think in that very song, it describes it. It's like, well, why do we tell it through Greek myth? I mean, why do we read the Bible, right? Why do we have texts that have always described, again, as Ken says, the human condition never changes, right? And yet those stories are always going to exist. We know that, right? And so that's, I think, what it is it's an eternal retelling of that condition, but with music that we are connected to, even on a vibrational level, in terms of generationally, as far as Americana goes, we're connected to that so deeply, and we know that is what that is meant for, and we love it as a result, right? Which is really, really cool.
And I think it's set up in song. You probably could talk to this as a musicologist way better than I, but the title number of the show, Way Down Hadestown, is a second line number. Coming from New Orleans, which is older than the United States. As a crossroads of culture, of indigenous cultures, of African cultures, of Caribbean cultures, of Spanish culture, of French culture, like it's everything, and the richness in terms of the religious cultures, and how deep that goes down. And so to talk about the myth of Hadestown and what it means in a second line number, which is a funeral celebration number or releasing of the spirits, right? Like it's this fun number in the show, and kind of spooky and weird. And we've gone through many manifestations of it where like Orpheus had a part in it, he does not anymore, right? Like all of this stuff. But like just picking that in terms of Americana, like that number at that time from those inspirations sets us up for the thing that Sean just talked about at the end of the show, right? Like that quiet moment, because we've already summoned the spirits, right? We've already released them. We've already evoked them.
It's huge, and it's representative, like even in that moment, right? That is the New Orleans, that's the funeral, right? Like and yet culturally, as much as that is the recollection of a life and the grief and the misery that comes within that, it is also a celebration, right? And so that's what ties us back into, again, even just in like as one singular part and piece of the show, it's like, yeah, here's this rousing number, but it is this draw of what the funeral music would be, right? But it's a celebration as well, right? It's a sad song, but we sing it anyways, right? And we sing it in joy, right? And we're gonna do it again.
I think the show works so well because of precisely that kind of paradox that you're talking about, Sean, where it's a sad funeral celebration. A funeral celebration. And I think that extends back to your question too, Lauren, about capitalism. It is, paradoxical, maybe contradictory to sit in a Broadway theater where your ticket probably was at least $100 and watch a musical about hunger. I mean, there's a kind of tension there that that all works of art that engage with these kind of issues of social inequality force you to engage with about the unethical decisions that capitalism forces all of us to make and that we're all implicated in. I mean, and you go in, Broadway is a commercial art. It always has been. I mean, it's there to make money as much as it is to create art. You know, if you're not making money, you don't create art on that stage. That's kind of the deal that that the landlords have made. They're, you know, to extend the show's metaphor, they're the Hades of Broadway. They probably wouldn't like that, but I think it might be a little true. But
don't tell Jordan we want to stay there.
Yeah, everyone but Jordan Roth, the show's Broadway landlord. But I mean, I'm just so fascinated by all of the contradictions and paradoxes on and off stage that make this show so complex and rich and interesting to think about. And I mean, there's also like a whole other thing. We could do 90 minutes on climate in this show because that's never not relevant. And yeah, I mean, it's just, there's so much.
We can't because it's not in the title of this panel. It's
Yeah.
gender, music, not climate. Okay.
Yeah, certainly that has nothing to do with any of the themes that are in our panel. I actually am going to cut us off here because I have been looking at the question and answer, and boy, we have a lot of really great questions, and I've been trying to triage them based on things that we've touched on and then things that I think we haven't, because I suspect we could just keep going like this for a really long time, but we have a very engaged audience. So I think I'm going to do this where I'm going to read out some questions to you all, and then anyone who wants to answer them can take them. And I'll just read people's first names that are there. So Gwyneth wants to know how you all perceive the role of the chorus in the musical and its relation to the major characters. She notes that Ken mentions that they were added later, and she'd especially like to hear more about how the play changed with their addition.
Yes, really quickly, to actually have bodies, you know, a reference to Ryan, whose scholarly work is about bodies on stage and how they mean. But to, as I, you know, mentioned before, like that we had a chorus kind of in the score, but unless you know, talking about like material bodies, like to actually get bodies on stage who identify early on as workers above ground, and then we, you know, see them as sort of like the workers below ground who've sold their souls, right, for security, presumably. That then their roles became kind of much clearer in terms of like what the stakes were. I talked about like ultimately the stakes are like, are we going to save the world or not? Right. And there was a way to do it in a way the show was perceived, you know, in our first pass at it, New York Theater Workshop, was it was kind of just about Orpheus and Eurydice. So you really had to care about them one way or the other to care if he got her out at the end or not. Right. But then as we recalibrated, as we understood more about like the role of the workers, and then as Aeneas and music and team music, you know, wrote their part more into the show, and David and Katie Rose like choreographed things for them to do. We saw them physically become machines, and we saw them kind of pull themselves out of machinery and recognize their individuality and their soul again. Then we have these new parts in the score. You know, if he can do it, so can she. If she can do it, so can we. Right? Like that was a new part of the show. So when they have this opportunity to leave, right, or when Orpheus is singing "If It's True," and you see some things start to go off, and you actually see the danger, and Hades can hear about like what actually rebellion could mean if he could lose his grip. Like we needed bodies on stage to be able to tell that story, not just vocally, but visually, and actually see human beings representing us, right? The people who don't necessarily have the power in the world and making the decisions, but needing some opportunity and agency. That was huge in the show, because it made the stakes not just a single person or a single couple, it made it for all of us, right? What they're doing mattered to everyone.
Thank you. We also had a number of questions that I'm going to combine a little because it relates to a question that we were talking about before we started this evening, which is casting choices. And I know that the casting of Hadestown could be its own 90-minute webinar, and we could talk about that, and people I think would find that really interesting. But one of our guests, Sylvia, was wondering about the possibility that Hermes could ever be played by a woman. And then I am going to scroll. Sorry about this. Someone else was asking, and I will find their name in a moment, about the decision in this, and I know you have other things to say about that, about Orpheus being played by a white man and playing into the white savior complex. And while those are two different questions, I think they can get us into a wider conversation about the influence of casting on how the audience is perceiving the musical and possibilities for its future.
Sean, you go.
I mean, yeah, I'm trying to think through. I mean, what comes to
I'm just
mind,
thinking about, like, you put different people into the show, right? And every time
exactly.
there's like someone new in the show, like, oh,
It's
how do
always
you
different.
mean on stage? What is the,
It's always different, truly. I mean, and I think that's also one of the interesting things about the piece, right? Is that you can do that, like even in the time since the reopen, we've had a number of different, and this is something that came up earlier, even as far as the comparison of the casting in New York compared to the casting on the road, right? If you're familiar with that, there are some significant differences in terms of in terms of identity as far as those roles go in both of those different spheres. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating thing. I mean, we had, I mean, yes, in terms of Orpheus being played by a white man, but I mean, there was a period of time where that was not the case in New York as well. Does it alter how we could explore the narrative of it? I think it absolutely can. I think it's also interesting to see the ways in which it doesn't in some ways, and even though it always will, that there's the element of that it is always present, and yet there is a large part of this story that is very specifically about also human experience as well, which I find very interesting to see how that plays on the stage. And that is, I think, one of the coolest things about that is also seeing how that, like, even gets reflected in our casting as far as the chorus, as far as the workers, and the entire ensemble, but particularly on that end, right? When you specifically look at this, as a group of characters who are helping to drive along narrative, helping to tell this story all right across the board, who are, as a group, as a mass, right, facing oppression, right? Like, what are all those implications? And again, there are subtleties, I think, within that, obviously, in terms of how different identities can exist within that. But I do think that there is something interesting about how it also plays into telling the fact that these stories and these narratives also are timeless across the board, right? They like, in terms of different, and culturally timeless as well, which is fascinating. But yeah, Ken, I don't know if you have any other specifics or thoughts as to, I'm trying to think of the specifics, especially as far as, like an example like that, as far as Orpheus being white or black. I mean, of course, there is a lot, and again, that could be an entirely different thing in and of itself. What I will say is there is a beauty, I think, to the fact that we can have that and have those, on the road, for instance, there is a very different dynamic and existence that happens between a Hades and Persephone, who are both black, versus a Hades who is white in New York, and a Persephone that is black in New York, right? And there are all sorts of dynamics within that, Persephone being a black woman in that contrast with, right? So there's, and I think that it's just a cool way that the piece is written and structured, is that we almost have to have those conversations in this sort of sphere because they don't get fully unpacked for us on stage in the same way. And I think that's actually really amazing, because it forces us to step back and think about those characters and think about all of those things, right? How do those dynamics play into that? And how do we have to consider that as audience members watching these characters in different identities enact these sort of archetype, positions on stage as well. I think that's what I'll say to that.
Exactly. I mean, there's always been a commitment in the show that we wanted, among our performing ensemble, right? The faces on stage, whether they're singers or playing instruments, we wanted them to reflect the diversity of our audiences as much as possible. There's not that many people, right? So when you sort of hire someone in the track and like something else will shift, right? And so if you have Black actors playing, Eurydice and Hades, and then maybe a Black actor steps into Orpheus, like that starts to mean something different on stage, then and you sort of shift those things around. We've had Black actors and white actors play Hermes all throughout, sort of shifting. I mean, Andre obviously won the Tony Award for it, and had done a very early workshop of it. But the Hermes in between, Chris Sullivan played it down in sort of like a Dr. John kind of way, different vocally. Levi, who's doing it on tour right now, is doing sort of like Elvis-y kind of Nashville Hermes. So like it's just a kind of different take on it. There's obviously, right, this question about, if you have a white actor playing Orpheus who's going to go there and save the world, is that a white savior? Like there's a reading there, right? But it's something that we were quite aware of, particularly since we developed this show with Reeve, right? Reeve Carney, who's like the palest person I've ever seen. Maybe Nick is a little bit paler than Reeve. They have a competition, right? But like they got cast because of their ability to like play the kind of innocence, because they sing like angels, right? Like, and there are other people who can do that too. But that's a big character to play. And so who else is playing what role and how is that perceived? We did take special attention moving the show from London to Broadway to introduce Orpheus in a different kind of way. But there was a part of him that was kind of like always Orpheus and confident. And like, we were like, that's not really right. It's also not really Reeve in the world and the way that he presents himself. So the actor kind of informed the role, but basically to introduce the character to the audience that it might be a little bit like not confident, a little socially awkward, a little bit more endearing. So he doesn't like come out of the gate as the hero kind of character, but like, let's get, particularly for people who don't know the myth, we didn't talk about that before. That was part of our job too, is to tell these myths for the first time for most of our audience. Really, most of our audience has had no previous exposure to any of these myths. So we've got to tell the story for the first time. And the way of telling this story was introducing an Orpheus who had a journey to take. He doesn't come out of the gate Orpheus of fame. He has to get there somehow. And so we hope that no matter who's playing Orpheus, is that we take him under our wing a little bit. Anais wrote a new part of the show where Hermes has a little bit of real estate, a fifth of the way into the show, where he tells us a little bit more about his kind of adoptive father relationship with Orpheus and like why he loves him so much and why he wants him to succeed. So, but yes, anytime we cast a new actor in the show, anytime like someone's out and someone new comes in, the show will mean something else. Same words, same notes, same choreography, different bodies, means something new. But hopefully still worthwhile, hopefully still interesting, hopefully still engaging.
On this topic of Orpheus, I wanted to just kind of pose an idea. I mean, it's interesting to me that a lot of people see him as succeeding in the end because he's also synonymous with failure. I mean, he fails to bring Eurydice back. He fails to bring the other workers back, right? To actually have a revolution take place. And so I wonder, like, are we left with the feeling that he's actually helped things, or are we left with the feeling that things are just back to how they were? And so I think that's like a major tension in the play too. Like, is he really a savior figure, or is he a failure in a way?
I mean, I would throw that out too. I would love to see sort of in the chat, like, what do people take away? Is the world any? Yes. Does Orpheus bring Eurydice out of Hadestown? No. He turns around. Like that doubt gets to him. Is the world different? at the end of this tale? I would love to know what people think. Or is it exactly the same?
Well, one of the questions that was posed to us, which was directed specifically at Sean, but I think it can be at everyone, which is talking about the cyclical ending that's moving and heartbreaking. And moving and heartbreaking can mean multiple things depending on what you feel is happening at the end of the play. And I think that's another way of looking at this. Is the cycle optimistic, or is the cycle suggesting that it is a failure and the world hasn't changed?
At the end of the show, like, I was not thinking of any of the myths on stage necessarily, but in this circular moment where Hermes is singing Road to Hell again, I was thinking of Sisyphus, and that he's just doomed to roll that ball back up the hill and it's going to fall down, and he's going to push the ball or the stone, probably in the original myth, back up the hill and ad nauseum. And I mean, that's what spoke to me in that moment. Maybe in kind of a depressing way, actually, and that Orpheus has failed. And, as Ken was saying, humans are humans, from antiquity to today. And it's the paradox for me. It's that, that was really depressing, but it's kind of an uplifting moment in the show musically. The music is telling us something different than the text and the action are. And that's intriguing to me.
One of our audience members brought up something that came up in our Q&A earlier, which was a question about dance and movement and how they're used to articulate gender and power. And they asked that question both of Hadestown, but also of ancient theater. This is Katie, of the ways in which dance and movement can be used to structure gender and power. And of course, that's a big question, but I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that.
Well, I'm sorry to jump in again, but remember that in ancient theater, all of the performers would have been men. So that adds a different element than we have today. And I think actually in Hadestown, the chorus, everybody does the same thing. So, gender is as visible as it can be on stage in the chorus, but everybody's doing the same choreography. So generally speaking, so I don't know if it signifies as much in terms of dance and movement in the show, apart from that, the kind of heteronormative moment where Hades and Persephone reconcile their, or have couples therapy through music, basically.
Yes, I would definitely say that about the worker tracks. They're not gendered because obviously the swings cover many of them. And like Sean, correct me if I'm wrong. But I mean, there are a couple of lifts, but it's just like who can do it. And if you're in the track, you do something different, right? You just have to be strong enough to lift another person and living it up. But as far as I know, that the tracks aren't particularly gendered, and we've had different gender balances there. We've had like, for men and a woman, and vice versa too. And we have, non-binary actors in our cast too. So I would say beyond the makeup dance, there is some choreo in All I've Ever Known, which is very delicate. It's like the, sort of intimacy direction of that kind of Orpheus and Eurydice kind of falling for each other. And like, that it's a little bit on the ground too. And it's very particular, but I do wonder, if there's a perceived power dynamic there. I think it's fairly balanced in terms of like who's on top and who's, underneath, but it's very gentle, I think. And but I hadn't thought about that before. I think it's a good question if there's a perception there of a kind of gendered power in the choreography.
May also depend on who's dancing it. I have one question because I cannot resist a question. I have a last question that's based on close reading, and it was a question asked very early on when we started. And as a classic scholar, I can't resist a close reading question. So Joshua asks, about the difference between a concept album part of the song and then the performance that was seen. So in the workshop version of Hadestown, Eurydice seems to have more of an independent spirit, singing, and I quote, Orpheus, I will not sing, Orpheus, all the pretty songs you sing ain't gonna shelter us from the wind, the wind, the wind. But when it went to Broadway, it changed to trying to trust that the song he's working on is gonna shelter us from the wind, the wind, the wind. This seems to me to take away some of Eurydice's agency, where she decides to realize that her reliance on Orpheus is flawed and turns it into a stronger faith in his ability to bring balance to the world. Do the panelists think this change takes away some of her agency, or do you think it adds power to her story? It's a hard one, but it's from a fan.
I love it. And thank you for the close reading, because I can sit there hours and hours and hours debating what's happening between Orpheus and Eurydice while she's trying to survive. And he's pursuing this vocation, essentially, that we'll find out is to save the world. But like, we have to get to a place where her leaving, like that neither of them looks like an asshole, right? Like, because we have to stick with them and we have to pull for them. So if she just abandons him because she doesn't understand art, then you're like, well, she's the asshole, right? And if he's just ignoring her because he doesn't recognize like anything that she's trying to survive, then like he's an asshole, right? And so I hope people will debate like who's the bigger asshole in this like breakdown of a relationship. But there's I hope we get to some place of like when she has to go, that it's hard, that she doesn't want to go, but that she has to go, right? And to calibrate us getting to that place, it was all of that sort of fine-tuned lyric work. And I think Anais goes into it in her book too. It was like, what does she say in that moment? Like, does she dismiss his pretty songs? Or does she believe in what he's trying to do, but she can't wait longer? Like finish it, right? And that's a new kind of thread in the show now. Like, well, then finish it, right? I'm going to do it. We'll finish it. And then when he finally does, she recognizes you finished it. And he's like, now what do I do? Like, because he's been so obsessed by it for so long. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking it.
I would also build on that and say, in the musical lyric, it sounds to me like she's wanting to believe, but she has a doubt. She has a doubt about the ability of his song. And that's what links the two of them, where, she's feeling doubt, and that's what makes her make that tragic decision to go to Hadestown. And then he at the end also feels doubt, and that's what makes that tragic decision to turn around, right? So they're kind of linked in that way, in that tragic moment. So that's what I'm kind of hearing in that decision to change that lyric.
Ryan, it looked like you had a thought.
I guess I'm just thinking about how in performance, the actor playing Eurydice has an agency that the character doesn't, and that almost regardless of what the lyric change was, like her decision is the same, and I don't know. That's as far as I got in my thinking about that moment in particular. But I'm fascinated by the agency that Eurydice has in performance in a way that the myth and the text don't grant her.
That's an excellent point. But I am seeing the clock here, and I'm remembering that we told these kind people that we would be ending after 90 minutes. And we could stay here all night, but I know that people have dinner and other things to do. So I want to take a chance to thank those that were behind the scenes who've worked so hard, both those here for us tonight and everyone at Duke that helped us put on this event. To thank DPAC for connecting us with their audiences, and to also thank our generous co-sponsors, the Department of Classical Studies, the Department of Theater Studies, and the Franklin Humanities Institute. And then last but not least, I hope through Zoom, we can all give a hearty thanks to my fellow panelists. I know that I've loved hearing all of their thoughts tonight, and we're so happy to have had you here. So I'm going to raise my Zoom hands and clap for you all, and know that everyone else is. So with that, I think we're going to say good night, and thank you all of you for joining us and staying with us throughout this 90 minutes.